of the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee to order, and start by the acknowledgement that in Ottawa, we meet on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted on February 25th, 2021, the committee is continuing its study on the subject matter of Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts.
Thank you. The committee recently received a letter from the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, Romeo, basically cautioning that Bill C-15 will have an effect of changing the definition of Indigenous persons as defined in international law. Can you speak to this important matter, and has the UN ever adopted a definition of Indigenous peoples?
Well, that's a good question and an important question, I believe. I can say this firmly, that there's no, to my knowledge, no UN body that has adopted a definition for Indigenous peoples. The only definition I'm aware of was a 1972 working definition by Martinez Cobo, who did a study, an important study, 5-volume study given to the UN in 1978, I believe, in 5 volumes. But the working definition back then, in 1972, was never adopted by the Working Group on Indigenous Population or by any UN body. In fact, I can also add that the 2 international covenants that I spoke about, signed on by Canada in 1976, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Both in their Articles 1 talk about the rights of all peoples, the right of all peoples to self-determination. Well, in international law, the term peoples was never defined. There is no definition for peoples either. So I think it's important to be aware of that, because once you decide to define something, then you end up excluding others. So I think that's the reason, the main reason behind the UN not adopting the definition for Indigenous peoples. To date, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been reaffirmed by the UN General Assembly at least 10 times by consensus. And what that means is that it was done without a vote. And so we can say safely today that no state in the world presently opposes the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's what it means. I'm pleased that Bill C-15, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, is based on my own private member's bill C-262 and goes further, as a matter of fact, in certain instances. It wasn't easy tabling a private member's bill. My first bill on the UN Declaration 641 was tabled in December 2014. It was defeated on second reading in April of 2015. In April 2016, I tabled a new and stronger Bill C-262. The House of Commons passed the bill at third reading on May 30th, 2018. However, a filibuster by a few senators killed the bill in June of 2019. Therefore, I fully support C-15. I'm especially pleased that C-15 acknowledges in its preamble the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls for justice by the National Inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, both of which call for the implementation of the UN Declaration. In reviewing Bill C-15, it is important to underline that its 17 preambular paragraphs have significant legal effects. They add important content to the 7 operative provisions in the bill, and they must be fully considered. In preamble paragraph 12, Bill C-15 adds that the Government of Canada recognizes that all relations with Indigenous peoples must be based on the recognition and implementation of the inherent right to self-determination, including the inherent right to self-government. This obligation has existed, as you know, Mr. Speaker, since 1976, when Canada ratified the two international covenants.
So one of the concerns, and maybe I'll go to Mr. Saganash with this one as well, to just explain how the declaration as being applicable in Canadian law, how that improves our current jurisprudence, I guess, and it improves upon the hard-fought battles that have been, or hard-fought and won battles in terms of the court decisions. And do we not risk undermining some of those court decisions by now introducing an entirely new system of law into Canada?
In fact, let me say this from the outset. The courts have already confirmed that provision that you read to us. The courts are using the UN Declaration, referencing the UN Declaration to interpret domestic law. And that's been going on for many years. Our human rights tribunals, provincial and federal, have been using the UN Declaration, even before it was adopted by the UN General Assembly. So what this Bill C-15 does, it just confirms what the courts have been saying and the interpretation and how courts have been using international human rights instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What this bill will add, in my view, is that, as a member of Parliament, that the Minister of Justice has an obligation under 4.1 of the Department of Justice Act to make sure that any legislation, before it is introduced, is consistent with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We don't have the equivalent for Aboriginal rights and treaty rights in this country. Bill C-15 will provide that.
Now, there's been a lot of questioning on whether the UNDRIP creates new rights, and there's been a lot of people creating fear that this UNDRIP is going to create new rights. Do you see this as reaffirming the pre-existing rights and inherent rights of human beings, Indigenous people in Canada, or do you see this as creating new rights?
It does not, and for a long time, the chairperson of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, every session of negotiations, she would repeat, this declaration does not create new rights. It just confirms the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, the pre-existing rights of Indigenous peoples. So I think it's this is a question that is not relevant in my mind, because both the Bill C-15 and the UN Declaration both reaffirm that these are pre-existing and inherent rights.